is that these guys actually hated each other. They really hated each other, and they loved killing each other. And this is an argument put forward using various sources to say, look, in the end, this is how we explain how the war happened. My sources say exactly the opposite is true. Because the fact is, there is nothing the people upstairs would have loved more than for these editors to fill their newspapers with hate. They would have loved it if these editors were just loading up images of the enemy, frothing at the soldiers to go and kill. Okay? They would have loved it. Clearly, they weren't allowed. I wouldn't doubt if they asked for some of this. But the editors didn't put it in there. And the only takeaway from this is the soldiers were not interested in getting newspapers. They could get that from the home front newspapers. Home front newspapers full of the frothing-mouthed hatred of the Boche or Fritz or Tommy. Okay? Full of that kind of stuff. They didn't want it. This is the most clear distinction between the two sets. If your audience are soldiers, they're not interested in an image of the enemy. So this was a major find for me. Women, everywhere in these newspapers, obsessively. But of course, nowhere more so than in the French newspapers. In the French newspapers, of course, the only nude depictions of women are in the French newspaper. The British and the German never depict nude women. The French newspaper is full of sketches of nude women. It's unclear which exact women are being discussed in the French newspapers, because in the British newspapers, if French women are discussed, it's the local women that are the local girlfriends. If British women are discussed, it's women on the home front. Same for the Germans, who discuss French women, or German women on the home front. In the French newspapers, you never know if they're discussing the French women just behind the lines or back at home. Nevertheless, there are a lot of articles discussing, first of all, fear of the women at home being unfaithful, with a very nasty racist streak of, especially with those West African soldiers that fight for the French army walking around the streets of Paris. There's one French newspaper, an elite newspaper by the Alpinists, it's an elite mountaineering unit. The first 6 issues of their newspaper is only about their sexual conquests. That's all they're discussing. And they have their own humor mixed into it. There's one I remember where one of the Alpinists is just getting dressed and the woman is still in the bed and she says, so what did you think of that counterattack? So, everywhere in the French newspapers, in the British newspapers, there is the discussion of, again, this fear of faithfulness on the home front with British women. Are they being faithful over here? All the time while the soldiers are constantly talking about how they're having relationships with French women. Okay, right there in the same newspaper. I hope those women back home are not sleeping with anybody, and boy, look at all the girls I'm sleeping with here. It's like this really strange... faithfulness for all armies is very much a gender distinction. To be a faithful woman means being faithful to the man. For a man to be faithful, it means to the nation. Okay, all 3 armies, that kind of language exists in all 3 armies. Faith is very gender-based, as who's faithful. Men are allowed to be unfaithful to their wives, as long as they're faithful to the nation. So the British have this, and there's lots of jokes that the British have about the local women, and about the constant chasing of the local women. The Germans emphasize the faithfulness of the women on the home front and discuss them as comrades as well. The nation is a nation of comrades. The Germans spend a lot of time talking about fellow soldiers as comrades, and also the women on the home front who are being faithful. They're also comrades working in war industries and helping the soldiers. But the Germans are also obsessed with women just behind the lines. Lots of discussion of French girlfriends and French wives are discussed. But here is one of the fundamental distinctions between the Western Front and the Eastern Front. In those Western Front newspapers, Germans discuss their French girlfriends and their French wives, and their interactions with them, and their use of their school French to have broken French conversations with those women. There is never a depiction of a Polish or a Russian or a Lithuanian girlfriend of a German soldier on the Eastern Front. In all of those millions of newspapers, no discussion of any kind of serious relationship with any of the local women. There are sketches of these women from afar, including the actually only instance of nudity in the German newspapers that I ever saw. It was a sketch of a Lithuanian bathhouse where one of the soldiers had sketched the women going in and out of the bathhouse. This is, again, I already talked about the alien nature of the Eastern Front to German soldiers. So far away from Germany, no local language they understand, having to wait for 2 weeks for the letters to get there. Well, this is another level, is that it didn't seem appropriate in German soldier newspapers to discuss having a Polish or a Russian girlfriend. Okay? Just another way to draw this distinction between the two fronts in the First World War. I will move toward the end here by talking about other possibilities for soldier newspaper work. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, the reason we have so much, the golden age of letter writing and newspapers is the Western Front in the First World War. We have 4 years of literate people with lots of time and resources to write this stuff. We'll probably maybe never get such a situation. Mobile wars tend not to have soldier newspapers. Okay, if you're moving all the time, you can't sit around a printing press and create these things. So that seems to be the division in terms of what I've been able to trace of where there are other instances where these newspapers can be written. In terms of American history, it does seem to be the case that Nathaniel Greene's South Carolina Gazette, 1782, was the first ever soldier newspaper. The Mexican-American War, this is something I'd be very interested in hearing about. There's 25 identified titles for the Mexican-American War, and that would be fascinating to see the depiction of locals through those newspapers. There are 300 titles in the Civil War, some of which have been done very well, but I'm not aware of an overall history of soldier newspapers for the Civil War. Again, the Second World War doesn't seem to have produced anything like the amount of newspapers. I want to mention, though, for the First World War, of course, once again, you were late helping your Canadian brethren. It's usually a 3-year wait for the Canadian soldiers for the neighbor to come on over, but anyways, it's in the past, it's okay. When you finally got around to it, you're very late to the game. Stars and Stripes exists, but does not seem to be very interesting until after the armistice, in which there's this period of American soldiers in the Ruhr, I mean, in Germany, where Stars and Stripes is very interesting from November 18 until mid-1919. So it's been identified as a possible very interesting area for research. There's a historian of Army newspapers in Colorado City who's kind of, he's like an archivist. He's identified the world's soldier newspapers, okay, but he hasn't really done significant studies of them. So he's identified these interesting newspapers, Stars and Stripes at that period. I don't know about smaller unit newspapers for the American Army in the First World War. Again, World War II not seeming a war of mobility in which there don't seem to have been the same moments. I imagine, though, perhaps around air bases in England, for instance, there would be possibilities for very substantial unit newspapers. There's, of course, a great tradition of incredible underground newspapers in Vietnam, which have been written about. But really, I mean, just thinking in terms of 10 years of blogs and web pages and unit newspaper, the material that has been created by static warfare in Baghdad or areas of Afghanistan are already leading historians to see there's going to be an incredible amount of social history to come out of just the recent past in terms of possibilities. So I hope someone's interested in doing that someday, and that's where I'm going to stop for now. All right.
Professor Nelson has agreed to take questions from the audience. So questions, please.
What about Russian newspapers?
Yeah, the huge problem is illiterate troops. So it's very difficult to do the social history of Russia in the First World War because of the issue of exactly that. We know of one one soldier newspaper that was produced, mentioned in a footnote in Jan's book, Patriotic Culture. So we know these have one newspaper read by officers, but this is the problem with the Russian side of the world.
You talked a little about the German newspapers. What kind of topics are most commonly censored out? And if domestic political divisions.
But you're openly not allowed to discuss domestic politics in the German newspapers. This is one of the few things that are laid out in 1916 when they set up the official apparatus for censors. Is we have political peace on the home front in Germany, and let's not discuss politics, and for the exact same reasons, let's not discuss religion. Unlike the French newspapers, which will discuss the 99% of the army that's Catholic. In Germany, you can't do that, and so you have very few references to religion. Mary can appear in French newspapers, but mother appears in German newspapers. Okay, mother really represents religion in many ways as a major theme in the German newspapers. So no domestic politics to be discussed. Same for the French newspapers. Disallowed any discussion of domestic politics. And I can say the soldiers would not have been interested in it. They can get that from the newspapers that still do arrive. Okay, so for the British and the French, none of these newspapers discuss domestic politics. That's covered by these lesser newspapers written for civilians. That's where we can go for that kind of thing. Those would be the main areas of automatic censorship. I was always interested in looking for kind of direct insubordination along the lines of the quote I gave you from the French newspaper. Again, no big surprise here. The only soldier newspapers that were allowed to practice open insubordination, the Australians. Great cartoons, like an officer saying to the men, once the I won't try to do an Australian accent. Once the British colonel gets here, stop calling me Alf. Constant kind of little low level. You officers mean nothing to an Australian mate, and the British are toffs who we can make fun of as well. So I mean, that's the only. A couple interesting things about the Australian newspapers. So that's a huge whole other area, but all army